for the fourth day of the second round of Social Vision conferences. We have a great day ahead of us, a lot of back-to-back panels, so I won't take up too much time. But before we get started and I hand it over to our first moderator, I'll just say we have a panel now at 11, another panel at 12, another panel at 1, and then our keynote lecture from Professor Elliot Wolfson at 3. So please don't miss any of those. Those are all going to be great. And we'll get a sprint going and then a little break and then really bring it home with the last panel or really lecture for this week. And then we'll be joining, regrouping on Monday for the last day of this round of the Social Vision conferences for 3 more really awesome lectures. And with that, I will hand it over to Chris Myers to moderate this first panel.
Hi, welcome. Glad that you could all join us for our session, which is entitled Reimagining Education. My name is Chris Myers. I'm the executive editor at Herder & Herder, which is the academic division of the Crossroad Publishing Company. And it was my distinct pleasure to be the editor who handled the publication of Social Vision by Philip Wexler. And I'm very grateful to him and his editorial team for putting together a very, very fine volume. So as I said, today's session is entitled Reimagining Education. We have 2 panelists. Let me take the opportunity to introduce our first, who is Yotam Hotam. Dr. Hotam is a senior lecturer in the Faculty of Education at the University of Haifa, a research fellow at the Bucerius Institute for Research of Contemporary German History and Society, and the Haifa Center for German and European Studies. His research focuses on the relations between the secular and religion in modern society and covers a variety of themes related to pedagogy and Jewish thought. So, Dr. Hotam, welcome. We look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you for being here and for inviting me to this panel. What I would like to do in my talk is rather quickly to reflect, perhaps also speculate on the relation between mysticism and modern education. And that seems to me to be a good starting point for reimagining education, which is the topic of our session. And I would like to start with 2 arguments that seem to me to be important within the book, within Social Vision, but also that one could argue that are 2 arguments that are also incompatible. On the one hand, clearly the relation between mysticism and modern education marks a central aspect in Rabbi Schneerson's educational vision. So that for him, this relation means that education should not be just a form of specialized training, but rather devoted to the teaching of the good life. Interestingly, and this is just a side issue, a side note that I want to make here, that Theodor Adorno, for example, in his Minima Moralia, also talks of the teaching of the good life, die Lehre vom richtigen Leben, which is for him the essence of metaphysics and has to do also with the connection between metaphysics and theology. But in any case, back to Schneerson, such a teaching for him involves a partnership with God. And talking about such a partnership applies, I think, what Philip in his book calls a vertical relation to the field of education. So this is the basic element within the mystical intimacy, the intimacy with the divine. On the other hand, there is here a bringing together of this kind of mysticism and a partnership with God and modern educational thinking, and which might seem odd. The presenting of the Lubavitch Rebbe as a modern thinker might seem also strange. Certainly from a Weberian point of view, emphasizing the modern demystification of the world, which is, I believe, even today, still a dominant image in the field of education. From such a point of view, it makes little sense to talk of Schneerson as a modern thinker, or to read the Hasidic vision as a resource for modern educational thinking because there is an imagined split between modern secular education and religion, between modern secular society, culture, politics, and religion, making religion an excluded term. Okay, so those are the arguments that I want to challenge, because what I would argue is that especially the focus on mysticism actually points less to the separation between modern secular and religious education, this commonly imagined split between the secular and the religious, and more, they point more to what I would like to call a secular religious continuum. Now, let me give a good example, what seems to me to be a good example for such a view, and this is the modern educational appeal for self-cultivation that was central to the tradition of the Enlightenment. What I'm thinking here is of the German concept, obviously the German concept of Bildung, which is commonly translated as self-cultivation, self-formation of the human being. So those of you who are less familiar with the concept related at the end of the 18th century, both to culture and to education, and served from that point on as an emblem from a rational, liberal, enlightened individual who practices universal rationality, makes autonomous decisions. And this is a point that, for example, Heinz Zunke, who I believe gives his talk later today, makes. And Heinz is, for me, one of the experts on the subject, and I'm looking for his presentation later on today. So what we have here is an idea of education that captures an idyllic, enlightened, secular, humanistic, neo-humanistic, and liberal form of education that acquired in the next centuries an iconic position, influencing a wide range of modern educational approaches. At the same time, however, Bildung also fuses the secular enlightened idea of self-cultivation with aspects of Christian theology. So this is the point that I want to emphasize. And it was also emphasized, by many scholars, certainly in the last years. The point that is usually made is, in this respect, is that in Bildung, this idea of self-cultivation, this modern idea of self-cultivation, the concept of human development to a complete and a consistent whole, as, for example, Wilhelm von Humboldt had put it, this concept is informed by the godlikeness of the human being found in Christian theology and evoked in mystical writings of the late Middle Ages. Especially in these writings, this concept is central and points to a divine presence in the human soul as much as to the shaping of the human being in the image of God. In its modern version, such an idea of human self-formation certainly goes through secularization. There's no denying of that. But secularization here implies not a total dismissal of original theological categories, but rather their transformation. Now, let me make this argument, this last argument, perhaps clearer in the following way. There is a famous point that Theodor Adorno, I'm going back to Adorno now. There is a famous point that Theodor Adorno makes that seems to me to be also relevant here. What Adorno suggests is that in the modern context, theological categories persist through their transformation, and that in such a way they migrate, this is a concept that Adorno evokes, they migrate into the secular social imagination. In the modern educational idea of self-cultivation, we may talk of such a migration because we are dealing with a secular adaptation of the notion of self-perfection that still echoes a mystical, intimate experience of unity with the divine by applying this unity to merely expressing a human betterment. The mystical heritage serves the modern idea of self-formation not only as an historical source, it also continues the modern idea of human development with its meaning. From such a perspective, there is then a deep-seated tacit religiosity that is invested in a modern secular education mission that reflects the ideals of the Enlightenment. An educational tradition that serves as a device for the formation of rational, liberal individuals also has devout origins, pointing not to a secular dismissing of religious categories, but rather to a challenging entanglement of secular and mystical notions. This is one. Now, my aim here is not to overlook the differences between the mystical and modern interpretations. Of course, there are differences, and one can talk about these differences a lot. But it seems also important to note that by talking about the transformation of theology in this case, we are not dealing with a secular religious split, but rather with a secular religious range in which mysticism becomes a resource for modern secular conceptual commitments. Now, let me turn back here to the relations between mysticism and modern education. And following this example, the idea that education should not just be a form of specialized training, but also it should involve a partnership with God, at least in its secularized version, seems to be not only relevant to the Lubavitcher social vision, but also to modern educational thinking. Of course, there are differences between a religious and educational visions of the religious educational vision and a secularized educational vision. But contrary to the prevailing thesis about the separation between modern secular and religious social visions, we may talk of a modern religious continuum, which encompasses a wide range of social visions, including religious ones, like Schneelson's. In such a way, we may challenge a prevailing image of secular modern education, and this could be also a form of a lesson for the future that is contrary-wise to the common separation between modern secular education and its religious other. We may reimagine a connection between them. This approach may prove to be important because it may also invite a revamp of the existing social and political alignments along new lines that are not informed by dichotomies and struggle between religious and secular imaginaries, but rather suggest new religious secular alliances that may share similar social visions of mutual understanding and tolerance. So what I would like to suggest here is something that could be related to as our own demand of the day, if to put it in Weberian terms, in a growingly, and I think there's no question about it, in a growingly intolerant world, which appears to render the realization of such a call more and more impossible. Thank you very much. Chris, I believe you are muted.
All right, there you go. That's better?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for that presentation. We will come back with some questions in a few minutes. Before we continue, I should mention that anyone who is sitting in on this session is welcome to submit questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And then we will have a chance to ask both presenters some of those questions towards the end of the session. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our second presenter, Dr. Peter McLaren. He is a distinguished professor in critical studies at the Donna Ford Atala College of Educational Studies at Chapman University. He is also the co-director and international ambassador for global ethics and social justice of the Paulo Freire Democratic Project, which is also located at the College of Educational Studies at Chapman. He's a professor emeritus of the University of California at Los Angeles, where he taught for 20 years. He served as honorary chair professor at Northeast Normal University in Changchun, China, from 2014 until 2019. He is the author and editor of approximately 50 books and hundreds of journal publications. So it is my great pleasure to introduce my very good friend, Peter McLaren.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be part of this panel and in the company of such distinguished scholars. I really appreciate the invitation. Now, I've been engaged in the development of critical pedagogy for approximately 30 years. And since the ascendancy of the Trump administration in 2016 and the contemporary resurgence of authoritarian regimes throughout Europe, I've been focusing more on present-day fascisms and even more recently, the Trumpist cult of QAnon. Critical pedagogy is often viewed as synonymous with the work of the great Brazilian educator, Paulo Freire, who was famously imprisoned by the fascist junta in 1964 for helping campesinos to read and discover their protagonistic agency by sharing their lived experiences as an oppressed group. Working under the conviction that critical pedagogy has, in the main, been politically domesticated by the politics of liberal progressivism over the past 3 decades, I have since 1995 tried to bring the field into conversation with a Marxist critique of political economy, rather than a Weberian one, with the anti-fascist work, of course, of the Frankfurt School, particularly that of Walter Benjamin, Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, and Herbert Marcuse, and with contributions from the tradition of Latin American liberation theology in Catholic social justice teaching. Well, what do I mean by liberation theology? Well, I'm referring to the Conference of Latin American Bishops. It was held in 1968 in Medellin, Colombia, marked by the beginning of a seismic shift in the Catholic Church. And it was here that bishops from all over Latin America agreed that the church should take a preferential option for the poor, while developing a catechism of liberation undergirded by the teachings of the Gospels so that the poor could liberate themselves from the institutionalized violence of poverty and capitalist exploitation. The philosophy undergirding liberation theology that combines Christianity with a Marxist critique of political economy was first drawn up at a meeting of Latin American theologians initiated by Gustavo Gutierrez in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil in 1964. Rabbi Schneerson's work, drawn from the teachings of the Torah, follows a long line of Hasidic teaching in recognizing the exploitative conditions of the present day, which echo back to the systemic exploitation of peasants in Roman-occupied Judea. Rabbi Schneerson's understanding of Judaism is of singular importance, I believe, in deepening the field of critical pedagogy, especially pertaining to his critique of economic injustice. Schneerson then deserves a special place in the pantheon of critical pedagogues. While the famous Brazilian educator and author of Pedagogy of the Oppressed, who was considered by many to be the father of critical pedagogy, was a Catholic who offered sharp criticisms of the church, his public work did not delve deeply into matters of the spirit. Schneerson's work, especially that which Professor Wexler refers to as socio-mystical justice, can offer an important dimension, I believe, to critical pedagogy. Schneerson's work is universal in the manner in which it elicits the moral, theological, and mystical meaning embedded in the catechism of everyday life, in the way in which his pedagogical imperatives deepen our understanding of the salvic work of God, culminating in the struggle for a worldwide covenant. Rabbi Schneerson's equating of the kingdom of God with the political and moral destiny of society can be seen in his emphasis on education's ability to transform the surrounding social milieu, to identify the pedagogical encounter with divinizing everyday life such that the home and the surrounding neighborhood is suffused with the ethos of Hasidism and thus conducive to a type of human development far different from that of secular Protestantism, while at the same time adhering to a non-denominational prayer. All of this serves not only as a fecund approach for creating a communal sense of sacralized solidarity, but a bulwark against despair. Here, socio-mystical justice, socio-mystical humanism, and socio-mystical ecology, along with the intersection of the Torah with discoveries of modern science, reflect distinct parallels with critical pedagogy, including the humanism of revolutionary critical pedagogy and eco-pedagogy. Where it differs from critical pedagogy is its unabashed pursuit of social justice initiatives within the sacred teachings of Torah, identifying the educational community's fundamental partnership with God that eventuates the sacralization of all of humanity. Rabbi Schneerson's pedagogy seeks out the moral and religious dimension of everyday situations, marking the advancement of knowledge and Torah as mutually constitutive. Rabbi Schneerson's inversion of the relation between class and crime, where individuals from the most affluent classes are seen as more liable to produce criminal behavior, reveals that it is the non-oppressed who would benefit from a pedagogy of liberation as much as the society's beleaguered and immiserated poor. Bringing revolutionary critical pedagogy into the sacred Hasidic ambit of Rabbi Schneerson's social justice initiatives would indeed help to bolster and perhaps even restructure liberation theology's presence within critical pedagogy. However, I have some reservations about Rabbi Schneerson's unwillingness in pursuing a socialist agenda, particularly his notion that to eradicate inequality would be to eradicate the possibility of true happiness. The idea that the division of rich and poor would not be replaced with a system of mutual ownership, for instance. He rejects the idea of a collective system of mutual ownership and complete equality. Instead, he holds to a liberal progressive idea of a reciprocal society in which individuals would be able to make meaningful contributions to the welfare of others. Here, society is premised on charity rather than a collective ownership of the means of production. Capitalist society remains in place and supplemented by a society of gift giving. As Philip Wexler notes, the idea is not a static state of personal completeness, as in the capitalist model, nor a static state of collective sameness, as in the socialist model. It is rather a dynamic state of constant imbalance and rebalance, of interpersonal inaction and expansion, of give and take, with each individual attaining a sense of personal fulfillment via the unique contribution they are empowered to make to the lives of all the people around them. This idea extends to the idea of education and the exchange of knowledge. However, could this be called a spiritualized cognitive capitalism? It suggests that the conditions of possibility for individual empowerment and happiness does not have an objective class basis and can be transcended as such. I suggest that this position is the result of a Weberian approach to class, following a neo-Weberian conception that reduces class to status, for instance, in lifestyle patterns. As Glenn Rakowski notes, the occupations at the heart of conventional social class categories are based not only on income, but also on notions of status and associated consumption patterns and lifestyles, derived, of course, from the work of sociologist Max Weber. Secondly, I think, and more significantly, consumption-based classifications of social class gloss over and hide the fundamentally antagonistic relationship between the two main classes of society, the working class and the capitalist class. But the class relation runs through personhood, runs through the process of becoming an empowered individual, runs through the process, I guess, as Heinz Sunker would say, of Bildung. In capitalist society, we take on capitalized life forms. So in conclusion, Rabbi Schneerson's social vision is urgently welcome today and could indeed help to reinvigorate North American critical pedagogy, especially with an inclusion, I believe, of an entangled trajectory, both political and spiritual, towards the elimination of capitalist value production and the creation of a social universe that is not powered by monetized wealth or value augmentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I very much appreciate yours as well. Before we begin, I have one question so far. It's not quite a question. It's from Michael Wexler. He brings up a point that could open up an initial conversation. And the conversation is actually a good question in terms of all of our use of jargon and getting caught up in our own language. For the non-academics amongst us, could you give sort of a summary statement, each of you, of what your position is in terms of Rabbi Schneerson's ability to reimagine education? And Yotam, I would ask you to begin that.
Thank you, and thank you, Peter, for a wonderful talk. My point has to do with this imagined and prevailing image of modernity and secular modernity, of education, modern and secular education, as distinguished from the religious past, from the religious heritage, from religious traditions. And this is a prevailing image that even today, and even in the last 20 years, we see a new kind of scholarship that tries to challenge this kind of image. But especially within the field of education, I think it's very central. And my point would be that this image is wrong. This image is wrong. And if we go to critical pedagogy, and here I agree with, for example, and here I agree with Peter. I mean, the question is that I would ask is in what way social vision, for example, the way that social vision helps us to understand Schneerson's overall vision for society, for individuality, for education, and so on. In what way it helps us to, or is important for the rethinking of critical pedagogy? Okay, this is a point that Peter made, and it's a question. And my answer is that, for example, within the context of critical pedagogy, it helps us to better identify, to better see, clarify the importance of theology to the concept of critique. And this is new. This is a new point. This is something that I would argue for many years was, in a way, we weren't aware of it. And we are now starting to be more and more aware that there is an entanglement of secular religious, secular theological notions within the idea of being critical, within ideas that are devoted to the, to the betterment of other human being, to the other in general. Ideas that are central within the context of modern secular, critical pedagogy, critical theory in general, and that we are becoming more and more aware of the role of this theological undercurrent. I would even say a secularized, redemptive undercurrent that exists within the most intimate ideas of critique. So I hope I made a complex argument even more complex. I don't know. Maybe I helped in understanding it. I don't know. So
I think it is very helpful. Thank you.
Okay.
And Peter, how would you respond as well?
Well, I think Yotam's comments were absolutely on the mark. I think that I have been writing for a long time, but only until recently have I actually come out as a, Catholic. And the attacks, just the personal attacks that have come my way have been pretty telling. people saying, I can no longer read your work now that I know you believe in God. And people just have shrugged their shoulders because they somehow assumed, as a Marxist, that I would be an atheist. And so there's been sort of a concerted effort on the part of some atheists to take it to me. But I had books by liberation theologians on my shelf since about 1980. And just a few years ago, I decided to pull them off the shelves. They were published by Orbis Books. And I felt that now was the time to really read them and get involved and start looking at theology as an important dimension of critique, as Yotam was saying. And I find that it's offered me different apertures to approach, especially actually by my reading now of Walter Benjamin too. I mean, it's amazing, the sort of compatibility and the. So I would say that critical pedagogy, as it has been institutionalized, has also been domesticated. So that was, it's sort of been inculcated with progressive liberalism. I think that needed to be critiqued by using arguments around the struggle for socialism, and also a dual-pronged critique by bringing in the work of theologians. And I think that the work of Rabbi Schneerson's should be included. Now, I have come late to Rabbi Schneerson's work, and it's been a joy and a challenge to read the work of Phil Wexler, somebody who I've admired for many, many years. And so now I think the real struggle that I'm seeing, especially living in the United States with Donald Trump and the QAnon people that have taken over the Republican Party, I find that this work now has a place of urgency. This kind of work has a place of urgency, and it has to have that theological dimension. Without it, we're at the mercy of the Trumpist cultists of QAnon, which I've been studying pretty rigorously over the past few months. Haven't written about it yet, but that's next.
I'll note that you always have about a dozen topics in the works as writing projects. So yeah, we're never short of content from you, are we?
That's true.
Yotam, if I could address an idea that you had discussed earlier. You had mentioned the concept of Bildung, and I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts about how you incorporate that concept into Rabbi Schneerson's concept of education.
I wouldn't go so far as to incorporate both ideas. It's true that, again, reading Social Vision, it's true that also Schneerson believes in this type of education, meaning in this type of cultivation or self-cultivation of the human being, self-betterment, self-perfection, okay? So those ideas resonate quite well also within, this Schneerson's educational vision, maybe because that's quite a Central European educational vision. So maybe it comes from there. I don't know. It's not my field of expertise, but within the Central European arena, this is quite a central image, a central intuition about what education should mean. It's about self-perfection, self-betterment of individual. It's about this kind of inner, the cultivation of inner powers into some image of a complete and of a consistent kind of a wholeness. And this also resonates quite well with what Schneerson is trying to do. And of course, both ideas are rooted in mystical sources. So again, I mean, you could see there something that resonates quite well on both ends. At least this would be my my argument. And so in this sense, I mean, you could talk about those kind of similarities. I mean, there are, of course, one could find also differences. I mean, you know, the way that the German culture, the German tradition thinks about practically what Bildung should mean. You know, the practice of it is quite different from the practice of it within the Schneerson's agenda. But again, the ideals are not that far away from one another. This would be, of course, my argument. And again, the overall argument is that even in this kind of Bildung as a kind of an emblem for what the ideals of the Enlightenment mean within the field of education. Now, this is a hardcore. I mean, the ideals of the Enlightenment, of a secular liberal individual, are informed by theological categories, so the difference here in this aspect within kind of a quite a hardcore religious educational operation and a hardcore secular educational operation is not that far away. So I'm trying to talk about a religious secular continuum in this sense, and not about this image of a split that you have a religious education, secular education, they have nothing to do with each other. So right. This is the way I don't know whether it answers your question, but this is the way I would talk about it. And I mean, after Peter's talk, and you know his Peter comments. After Peter comments, then you know, if I may ask him a question, following his comments, for a minute ago. I mean, I'm very interested in how he sees even Illich, for example, who is both a Catholic, I believe, or you know, and also a Marxist. So whether, I mean, are you inspired by Illich's writings, especially from the 70s, you know, the end of school and all that, or, I mean, I'm just curious, what would be your take on Illich? Because it seems that, you know, a lot of what you talked about has a lot of, you know, a central place in Illich's writing.
Yeah. I think that Illich's, you know, Deschooling Society, his work, you know, as a Jesuit, it's interesting that I believe that actually right now is a time for a resurgence of focus on the work of Illich, actually. But I've been more.
I agree. I mean,
yeah, I think he needs to be brought back.
Brought back, yeah.
Resurrected, if I could use that term. But I've been looking also at the work of Ernesto Cardenal, who you know, was considered perhaps one of the greatest poets in Latin America. He in Nicaragua, he was you know, he was a priest, but he decided to take on a political role as Minister of Culture in the Sandinista regime. When Pope John Paul II arrived in Managua, there was a famous picture of Ernesto on his knees trying to kiss the papal ring, and John Paul II scolding him, and because he assumed, you know, an official political position in the Sandinista government. Now, of course, we know what happened to that revolution. We know Ortega's. I'd like to stay away from Ortega, you know, as far as possible. But you know, there've been Camilo Torres, for instance, a priest that worked in an armed guerrilla struggle. I think he served as a chaplain in Colombia, for instance. I'm thinking about the 6 Jesuit scholars, really important scholars. 6 Jesuit scholars, their housekeeper's daughter, that were murdered on the campus of the Universidad Centroamericano in San Salvador. And that happened in 1989. Their work, phenomenal work, and the government, with the complicity of the United States, the government sent a death squad to assassinate them. And of course, we know Archbishop Romero, 1980, was gunned down saying mass. He's now, I think he's now a saint. I think he's
been canonized. Yeah.
He's been canonized. So I'm very focused on the work of liberation theologians and the attempts by the United States to crush liberation theology. So we have, Pope John Paul II, of course, who was raised in communist Poland and was very anti-communist. One can understand that. Also with Pope Benedict, right? We can understand, we can understand his aversion to communism, and in some sense, we can understand his suspicion of liberation theology. And then we have, of course, Pope Francis. What's his position? But I've been looking through a lot of the correspondence between the U.S. Embassy in the Vatican, which now has been made public, and the attempts by the United States to really crush this movement. And I think that liberation theology, I think that there's a space now to really take it seriously and really bring it into our conversations about educational reform. And so a Cardinal, for instance, Ernesto Cardinal, he would say, how could you be a Marxist? And he said, Christ led me to Marx. This is really important. I think in 2015, I went to Argentina to meet with Bishop Colombo because he was a friend of Pope Francis. They were childhood friends, and I wanted to get some insight into what Pope Francis might feel about liberation theology. And I think he's somewhat inviting towards it, but as long as you keep the Marxist aspect of that, on the side. So so I that's what sort of drawn me to liberation theology is really the work of these priests that have taken the words of the gospel seriously and put their lives at risk for defending the peasantry and the campesinos who are too often gunned down with impunity by death squads. And it's still happening. I mean, it's still going on.
Yeah.
And,
To bring the conversation back to the specific observation that Yotam was making about Ivan Illich. It's an education session. I don't want to take it too far away from the social vision conversation, but a lot of critical theorists feel that Illich's theories were overlooked at a time when Paulo Freire's work was so deeply embedded into the education system and into, the leading critical pedagogue. I'd just be curious to know from either one of you why you think Illich did not have that same benefit. And also, I would make the observation that I do think that there is going to be a reemergence and a revisiting of his theories on critical pedagogy.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I mean, this is a good question. First of all, I agree. I mean, there needs to be a revisiting of Illich, and certainly within the context of critical thinking. And I really don't know. I mean, I'm asking myself the same question. Why would Illich's writing, especially from the 70s, those are that interest me. I mean, again, the end of school and all that. you know, didn't receive this attention within critical thinking like Paulo Freire's, like Paulo Freire did. And it's a question I don't know the answer to it. Of course, I mean, you could say that Illich is more suspicious because, I mean, biographically speaking, he has a very complicated biography coming from where he came, and I mean, is also denominational origins are more complicated, and he was also criticized, I mean, by the Catholic Church. So again, I mean, also from that direction, he didn't have a good support. So, but I really don't know. I mean, except for those kind of historical, social and historical context, I don't know. You know, it's a good question, which really troubles me. I don't know, Peter. Maybe you have a better explanation for why he wasn't so well received at that time.
I think Chris is right in the sense that Freire's work really, in a sense, overshadowed Illich. At that particular historical juncture in which Freire's work was being at least rediscovered in North America. Illich had that institute in Cuernavaca, which was very famous, and people from all over the world would go and listen to the seminars and lectures that came out from there. But Illich also, was a major critique of the medical establishment. He was a great critic of technology. I think that it would be really interesting to make assumptions. Perhaps people like Barry Sanders, who was a student of Illich, could speculate on what Illich's views might be now today with the kind of fourth industrial revolution, right? With AI and the kind of technologies now that are available, and I would think that Illich would be connecting that with perhaps a dystopian critique of the surveillance society. I think it'd be, so he was, really I think medicine and education were two sort of focal points for Illich's critique. So. But it's interesting too, because I think it was in the 1980s. I'm not sure exactly, but I remember some friends of mine were trying to, I think Illich was, I think he was lecturing, he was ill, he was dying, but he was, I think, lecturing at Penn State, if I'm not mistaken.
He was at Penn State, yes.
And it was difficult to get people interested in his work, I think. That's what I heard. Some people wanted to sort of, do some edited books on Illich, and it sort of fell through the cracks. And that was interesting too about Paulo Freire, because in the 1980s, I was contacted by a publisher in England, Routledge, and who asked whether anyone might be interested in Paulo Freire now. And I said, I think so. And there was this blitz of Freire's work, but the same didn't go for Illich.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, I predict a reemergence. So
yeah, or there should be one. In any way,
should be one. Yes, absolutely.
One. Yeah,
absolutely.
I know, Peter. I think you know David Gabbard.
Yes.
Yeah, he is a devotee.
I was he did his dissertation, I think, with Joel Spring.
Right.
I was the outside reader. I was on his dissertation committee.
Mm-hmm.
So somewhere I've got his dissertation on Illich somewhere. Yes, absolutely. He'd be good.
We'll have to light a fire under him then.
Right, exactly.
So we have a few minutes left. Does either of you have some key question for the other about what we've listened to so far, which have been fascinating concepts and a great conversation? Peter, anything for you?
Well, I'm just I'm just so preoccupied now with what's happening in the United States with Trump. and the evangelical circles now, which are merging with the QAnon cult. And I'm just wondering how closely this is being followed outside of the United States. Like in Israel, for instance. I mean,
yeah.
Good question.
Well, it's a good question. I mean, we have our own problems. As you can imagine, we have our own problems. For me, it's interesting. I mean, just very briefly. I mean, from a very narrow political perspective, it is interesting to see that a lot of Israelis are actually, supporters of Trump, not because of, what he represents within the American arena, but because of other reasons. I mean, by ignoring what he represents within the American arena, and for other reasons, they are supporting. They are, in a way, supporting supporters of Trump for, because of inter-Israeli, also Middle Eastern complexes. I just want to say that, for me, I mean, just, kind of reciprocating here anxieties. My own political and social and political, the social political problems that interest me within the Israel and Middle Eastern context has to do with the shifts within the political and religious arenas, and the relation between the political and the religion within Israel, within the Middle East as a whole. One can say in the world in general. There is a change in this relation between the political and the religious, and not for the better. And you can see it in Israel, you can see it in other places in the world. I mean, Israel is, I would argue, it's very similar to Turkey in this respect. And those are the issues that interest us here. So maybe it differs from what you have in the US, I don't know, but and there is something to say about it, something to do about it, not by continuing, and this is my approach to it, not by continuing to reproduce this idea of a split between, say, secular national state and religion, by somehow finding a better way, a good way, to hold to this alignments. I mean, there are a lot of people in Israel who are conservative and traditional, and you need to do something about it. You need to talk with them. You need to make sense of what are their interests, and to be able to communicate with traditionalism in this sense. So, and still hold to some ideas of critique, some ideas of enlightenment. And this kind of spagat, or this kind of, I would say, pirouette, is what is needed, I think, in Israel. And this is why I'm trying to make sense of those relations between the political, the religious, the secular, and so on, in a way that may introduce or suggest new, I would say, new and non-conflicting ways to better and mutual understanding.
How would this affect the future of ecumenism? That's another good question, right?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. And in our last couple of minutes, Yotam, I'd give you last opportunity to address any question that you have to Peter.
No, I'm very intrigued by the move that Peter is doing, and also I'm inspired by his books and his writings along the year, and the move that Peter is now doing from reacquiring a knowledge of the this theological layer and Marxism. I mean, this is a very interesting maneuver. This is a very interesting combination, and I think it's. I agree that the way I read it, it's very present. It's highly present within modern Catholic thinking, and which is very interesting. And this is a connection that interests me. And in a way, I mean, between more generally defined between materialism and theology. I mean, this combination of materialism and theology, some kind of a rethinking of a theologically imbued material world. It's very interesting to me, and it's not a question, just a reflection for something that I hope to hear more about.
Good, good. We do have one further question. It's addressed to Peter, I believe. Why do you think this merging of evangelicals with QAnon is happening? And what could be done in the field of education to reverse these frightening trends? Politics as substitute theology, question mark? How would you address that?
Well, I think it would be making the theological more political and the political more theological. I think that would be the overall approach. No, it is frightening, and I'm getting emails from friends that I had that I've sort of kept in touch with from my childhood, coming from Canada, even with links to videos saying this connects all the dots, and don't get vaccinated because have you heard about the new developments in nanotechnology, and Bill Gates is in all of this stuff. It's very anti-Semitic, a lot of it, without, I think, people realizing it. And just the number of people that are engaged with the media promoting QAnon, and of course the questions about platforms, 8chan, 4chan, Spencer, what is it, Parler? Should these platforms be shut down? Questions of free speech. All of this is coming to a head in ways that in such powerful ways that I've never thought, I never anticipated that it would be like this. So I think that, critical media literacy has a place that, it has now a more essential place than ever. And also, this whole question of post-truth is really, really important. And I think we need to engage students in the question of post-truth, making distinctions between, opinions and arguments, and all these have to be major topics that they just don't percolate through universities, randomly, but we have to sort of build them into the structure of the university curriculum.
Formalize it more, yeah.
I think
there's a follow-up question also. Is it your opinion that it's a displaced messianism?
Displaced messianism, that's interesting. That is very interesting. Yeah, I'd have to think about that. I think that there certainly is a misanthropic current, and where you have this misanthropic current, it's always followed by misology, and misology is really the hatred of reason. The hatred of reason, misology. It always follows this misanthropy. I think this needs to be unpacked, and I think it impact in many different ways. And I think my friend Petar Jandrik, who's running the new journal of post-digital technology, I forget, post-digital technology and post-digital pedagogy and science, something like that.
Something like that, yeah.
He's really engaged with a lot of people that have been writing on technology for years. In all kinds of different disciplines, in exploring these questions. I think that it's incumbent now on journals to, have free access to these articles and these investigations without waiting, 6 months before you see your article in print. I think a lot of things have to happen in publishing, in education, in the public sphere, in the public square. They all have to happen simultaneously. But, I look at this QAnon and I see, I actually, I do a lot of reading in history in the Second World War. my dad and was a Royal Canadian engineer. My uncle helped sink the Bismarck battleship. There's a stamp to him in Canada. I've always been immersed in Second World War history, and this sort of QAnon reminds me of sort of the mystical occult sort of traditions embedded in Nazism. I mean, it really is frightening to me, and I think it demands a kind of urgent response from education, from publishing, from intellectuals, around.
And to bring it back to the Social Vision book, I think that there is a remarkable amount of outward-looking thinking coming from Rabbi Schneerson. When you look at his concepts of education, it's surprisingly different from what you would have expected if you took a stereotypical view of it.
Yes, and his ability to gently critique presidents, in his letters, for instance. So I found absolutely amazing just how he was able to sort of embed that element of critique in very cordial communications with politicians of power.
Well, with that, I think we need to conclude. I'd like to thank both of our panelists, Yotam Hotam of University of Haifa and Peter McLaren at Chapman University. An excellent session. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
And at this point, I'll turn it back over to Jesse Noiley, who will escort us out.
All right.
Thank you so much, Chris. And thank you, Dr. McLaren and Dr. Hotam, for an excellent panel. So now we're going to seamlessly transition into our next panel, our 12 o'clock panel, which will be a conversation between Catherine Casey and Heinz Sunker, moderated by Michael Wexler. So let's first of all get Michael into this room, and then we will, in just a few moments, hopefully transition into that panel. Michael, let me get you to turn your